Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Let's get started, inshallah ta'ala. How's everyone doing? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how can he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light. He's not a soul. He has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled Master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And as always, brothers and sisters, I ask that Allah grant myself and you sincere and good intentions, that what we do is done for his sake only. Ameen. So we've been reviewing in this book, the 7 Hadeeth. We've been reviewing Hadeeth number 2, which is known as Hadeeth Jibreel. We're on page 8 in the Green Book. For those of you who don't know where we are, we're on page 8. And we're at the part where it says, Imam Muslim, may Allah have mercy on him, narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to perform salat. So to remind you what happened in the hadith, the angel Jibreel alayhi salam came in the form of a human being. And he said to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tell me about Islam. And our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Islam is to testify that no one is God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to perform salat. So this is where we are in the hadith, to perform salat. So our Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said that one of the very important matters in this deen is that we perform a valid salat. And I remind you also that the purpose of this book is to teach what we call the obligatory knowledge, the knowledge that every Muslim needs to know. And among that knowledge is how to perform a valid salat. I'll also remind you that the rulings that are in this book, the judgments that are in this book, are the judgments of the Shafi'i madhab. Okay, if any of you learned Hanafi or Maliki, for example, this may sound a little bit different than what you've heard, but these are the Shafi'i rulings. And what's important is that a Muslim follow one of the madhabs, because this is how he will know that what he's doing is correct, insha'Allah ta'ala. So let's talk about salat. The first thing we need to know about salat is that salat, in order for it to be valid, you need to know the conditions, and you need to know the integrals, and you need to know the invalidators. Okay? You need to know the conditions and the integrals, because if you don't do one of those, if you leave one of those out, your salat is not going to be valid. You need to know the invalidators, because if you do one of the invalidators, it renders your salat invalid. So you need to know the conditions, the integrals, and the invalidators. What's the difference between a condition and an integral? Okay, a condition is something that the validity of the salat depends upon, but it is not part of the salat. I'm going to say it again. A condition is something that the validity of the salat depends upon, but it is not a part of the salat. Okay, an example of a condition of salat is to be in a state of purification, like to have wudu, for example. Okay, having wudu is not part of the salat, right? Making wudu is not something you do in the salat, but nonetheless, your salat is not valid unless you are in a state of purification. These are called conditions, and the salat has 8 conditions. purification being one of them. What about an integral? So a condition is something that the validity of the salat depends upon, but it's not part of the salat. An integral is something that the validity of the salat depends upon, and it is part of the salat. Okay, an example would be like reciting the Fatiha, like bowing and going into ruku'. These are things that are part of the salat, and if you don't do them, then your salat will be invalid. The third thing you need to know to perform a valid salat are the invalidators. These are the things you must avoid while you're in salat, because if you do any of those things while you're in salat, then it will render the salat invalid. And so, before we talk about how to perform the salat properly, we're going to first talk about the conditions. And it makes sense to mention the conditions first before we mention how to perform salat, because the conditions need to be done before you start the salat. Okay, so in real life, before you actually enter into salat, you need to do the conditions first. So also in this book, we'll talk about the conditions first before we talk about actually performing the salat. It says, section 3, purification. In order for one's salat to be valid, one must be pure from Hadeeth and from unexcused najas. Okay. So among the 8 conditions of salat is that a person be in a state of purification. When we say purification, what do we mean? In general, we mean that the person must be pure from Hadeeth and from unexcused najas. In general, there are certain cases where it may be different. And we'll get to them in this book, inshallah. What do we mean when we say pure from Hadeeth? What is Hadeeth? Okay, Hadeeth is what we call Amrun i'tibari. Okay, it's something that we consider to be there. Meaning the Sharia gives a ruling that this thing called Hadeeth is present on your body. Even though it's not something hissi, it's i'tibari. It's not something hissi, it's not something that you can see and feel. It's not something empirical. Hadeeth is not something that you can see on your body. Okay? But the ruling of the Sharia is that it's there. Okay? And if you have Hadeeth on your body, you must remove it in order to perform a valid salat. There are 2 types of Hadeeth. One type of Hadeeth is called minor Hadeeth, and that type of Hadeeth can be removed by making wudu. There's another type of Hadeeth called major Hadeeth. Major Hadeeth is removed by making ghusl. So one of the conditions that must be met in order for you to perform a valid salat is that you must be free of minor Hadeeth and also of major Hadeeth. The other thing you must be free from is unexcused najas. Okay, najas, something is najas if the religion declares it to be filthy. Okay, if something is najas, then you have a religious obligation to avoid contact with it. You don't want it to come onto your body or onto your clothes. If this najas is on your body or on your clothes or on the ground and you touch it while you're in salat, then this will invalidate your salat. Even if the najasa is in something you're carrying, like if you have some najasa inside of a bottle and the bottle is in your pocket, then this also will invalidate the salat. Although there are some types of najas that are excused in the salat. So if you have an excused najas, then that will not invalidate your salat. But you need to be free from Hadeeth and free from unexcused najas. It says, this is a large section. So I have subdivided it into the following subsections. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to purification. Even though, like I said, there are 8 conditions for a salat to be valid, and purification is only one out of the 8. But there's so much to say when it comes to purification that I just made it a whole section of its own. Okay, and this section has 6 subsections under the heading of purification. So what are the things we're going to talk about when it comes to purification? Letter A, we're going to talk about the conditions of purification. Okay, just like how salat has conditions that must be met in order for the salat to be valid, Also, purification has conditions that must be met in order for your purification to be valid. So we'll talk about the conditions of purification. Section B, we'll talk about lifting minor Hadeeth, which means making wudu. Section C, we'll talk about lifting major Hadeeth, which means making ghusl. Section D, we'll talk about making tayammum, which is something you do when you're not able to make wudu or ghusl. Section E, we'll talk about what things are prohibited to a person if they have Hadeeth on their body. Okay, so there are certain things that you can do if you're free from Hadeeth, but you cannot do them if you have Hadeeth on the body. And the last thing we're going to talk about in the purification section is removing najasa. We're going to talk about how to remove najasa from your body or from your clothes or from the ground or whatever place, insha'Allah ta'ala. Okay, section 3A, conditions of purification. Oh boy. There's a lot to talk about here, mashallah. So let's go into it. It says purification has 5 conditions. Number 1 is Islam. Okay, so first, you should understand that one's purification is not valid if it comes from someone who is a kafir. Okay, if a kafir makes wudu, he does not enter a state of purity by making that wudu. Okay, the Hadeeth that's on his body does not get lifted. Okay, because purification is only valid from what? From a Muslim, from someone who has Islam. I will mention that there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. This is in general the case. In order for your purification to be valid, you have to be Muslim. But the 2 main exceptions to that rule are when it comes to removing najasa. Removing najasa is something that does not require an intention, and therefore it can be done by a kafir. Okay, ultimately, the reason why Islam is a condition here is because purification requires an intention, and an intention is only valid from a Muslim. But because removing najasa does not require an intention, it's possible for a kafir to do that. So if you had, for example, a drop of blood on your shirt and a kafir decided to go wash your shirt for you, then if it comes back cleaned in the proper way, then we say that shirt is now purified, even though a kafir did it. It's okay. What's the other exception to this rule? The other case where purification is valid from a kafir? It would be the case where a Muslim man married a kafir woman, like say a man married a Jewish girl. In this case, if that Jewish woman has her period, if she has her monthly menstruation, when her monthly menstruation ends, she will need to perform a ghusl before her husband will be allowed to lie with her again. And this ghusl that this kafir woman will perform, it's not a valid purification because she doesn't have Islam. The Hadeeth is not removed from her body. Okay, so this is because Islam is a condition for purification to be valid. However, even though this ghusl does not lift Hadeeth from her body, the Sharia accepts this ghusl as something that will now allow the husband to lie with his wife again. So those are 2 types of purification that can be done by a kafir. Number 2, mental discrimination, which is called in Arabic tamyiz. Okay, tamyiz or mental discrimination is when a child has reached an old enough age that when he is asked a question, he can respond with a reasonable answer. Okay, for example, if you see a child who's say 5 or 6 years old, most likely you'll be able to ask that child, what school do you go to? And that child will be able to tell you the name of his school. Or if you ask him, what's your teacher's name? The child will be able to tell you the name of the teacher. This is called mental discrimination. Okay. If you speak to a child who is 3 years old, if you ask the 3-year-old child, what school do you go to? The 3-year-old child might turn around and say Paw Patrol or cheeseburger. They might say something that doesn't make any sense given the question. If the child is so young that they can't give a reasonable answer to a question asked to them, then we say this child does not have mental discrimination. Okay. Some other scholars, they define mental discrimination as being independent in the bathroom. So some scholars said that if a child is old enough that the child can go into the bathroom by himself or herself and use the restroom and clean him or herself properly afterwards without any supervision, then this means that the child has reached mental discrimination. Prior to mental discrimination, the acts of worship are not accepted from the Muslim in general. Number 3, it says lack of barrier preventing water from reaching the intended organ. So the third condition for the validity of one's purification is that there must not be something that prevents the water from reaching the thing that the water needs to reach. So for example, when we make wudu, we have to wipe our heads. Okay. That means there can't be something between your head and the moist item that you're wiping with, like say your wet hand. There can't be something between your wet hand and your hair that prevents the hair from receiving the moisture from the hand. Okay, if you're trying to wash your arm, like in wudu, there can't be something on your arm that prevents the water from flowing over the place that it needs to flow over. Okay, the main thing that I like to, or that I feel I need to remind people about when it comes to this is fingernail polish. Some women, they wear fingernail polish, and this fingernail polish is a barrier. Okay, when that woman makes wudu, the water is going to flow over top of the fingernail polish, and it's not going to touch her fingernail. Okay, because the fingernail polish is a barrier between the water and her body. Okay, and so because there's a barrier that prevents the water from reaching the place it needs to reach, this person's wudu is not going to be valid. This is also true if she makes ghusl. Okay, so as always, when I get to this section, I warn people against the wearing of fingernail polish. Okay, this is a very dangerous habit, mashallah. But it's not just about women, though. There are also cases where certain types of bandages, casts, and things of that sort may also prevent water from reaching the place that needs to be reached. Number 4, someone asked about fingernail polish labeled halal. Just because it's labeled halal doesn't mean that it's not a barrier. Most of the time when people label something halal, what they're claiming is that it doesn't contain any haram ingredients, like there's no pork in it, for example. That doesn't mean it's not a barrier. Okay, when they say it's breathable and water-based, I don't even know what that means. So in the end, like, I'm not a chemist. I'm not someone who can speak to the details of how one type or brand of fingernail polish is different from another. What matters is the Sharia ruling, which is that if the water does not reach your fingernail, then your wudu and your purification are not valid. Okay, for this reason, I always advise women not to wear fingernail polish, because it's your responsibility to be sure that what needed to be washed got washed. And if you're not sure, then how can you continue? I say just remove the fingernail polish. It's not really that important, inshallah. Number 4, it says flowing of water over the organ. Okay, this condition only applies to things that need to be washed. So in purification, sometimes there are things that need to be washed, like in wudu. You have to wash your face, you have to wash your arms, you have to wash your feet. In ghusl, you have to wash your whole body. Okay, but there are other things in purification that instead of needing to be washed, they only need to be wiped, like your head in wudu, or like your face and your arms in tayammum. These things need to be wiped, not washed. So for number 4, this particular condition only applies when washing, not when wiping. Whenever you're washing something in wudu or in ghusl, then the water needs to flow over that part of your body. So for example, if you wanted to wash your arm in wudu, you need to use enough water that the water Like if you held your arm downwards, the water would flow. It would flow over it. It can't be such a small amount that it just stays in one spot. It needs to be flowing water. So the amount of water needs to be enough that it flows over your body. Now, of course, if you just naturally, you know, let the water flow on its own, the water is probably not going to flow everywhere that it needs to flow. Okay, so there's no harm if you use your hand to push the water in the direction you want it to flow in. Okay, you can use your hand to push the water around your arm to make sure the water flows over everywhere it needs to flow over. But the important thing here is that it needs to actually flow. Okay, and you can tell, you can feel the difference between when the water is flowing and when now there's so little water that all you're doing is wiping. You can feel the difference, mashallah. And number 5, it says pure and purifying water. So the water that you use, and again, this is only applies when you're actually using water. So we're not talking right now about tayammum, which is when you're going to use dust. But when you're using water, this water must be pure and purifying, insha'Allah ta'ala. So I'm going to be talking about this in more detail in a few moments. First, I'm going to go make the Maghrib Salat, which I haven't done yet because I wasn't sure if it was in, but now for sure it's in. I'll see you after a few minutes, insha'Allah ta'ala, and we'll talk about pure and purifying water. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Just give me a second. For this section on water, there's something I want to share with you, inshallah. Yes. Okay, so before I read through this, I want to introduce you to this framework here, inshallah ta'ala. And that is that water is either pure or it's impure, meaning filthy, contaminated by najis. Okay? Water is either pure or it's contaminated by najis. That's the first kind of division in water. It's either going to be pure or it's going to be contaminated. But if the water is pure, okay, if the water is pure, then it will either be purifying or it will not be purifying. Okay, so I'm going to go back to number 5 in the list of the 5 conditions. It says pure and purifying water. So what that means then is that in order for the water to be valid for purification, it needs to be this kind, the green. It needs to be pure and purifying. This is the kind of water that may be used for purification. As for this over here, the blue, this water is pure, but it's not purifying. So this water may not be used for wudu or ghusl or to remove najasa. However, it's pure, so you could still drink it. If it gets on your body while you're making salat, for example, it will not invalidate your salat because it's pure. Right? It's not filthy, it's pure, but it's just not purifying. Okay. Obviously, if the water is impure, if it's been contaminated by najis filth, then you may not have it on your body or your clothing or the place where you're praying or in anything that you're carrying. Now, that said, let's read. It says, water is pure as long as it has not been contaminated by najasa. Okay, najasa is just another way of saying najas in Arabic. Najasa is another way of saying najas. It says, if the water is less than 2 qullas in volume, then contamination occurs if any najasa comes into contact with the water. If the water is 2 qullas or more in volume, then contamination only occurs if the smell, color, or taste of the water perceptibly changed due to contact with najasa. Okay, so this whole paragraph is talking about this first distinction between pure and impure. Between pure and impure. How can you tell if water is pure or if it's been contaminated? We ask ourselves, how much water is there? So in the case where najasa comes into contact with water, we need to first ask, how much water was there? Because if the water was less than 2 qullas in volume, then this water is automatically contaminated by najis filth. Automatically. Because if there's a small amount of water, meaning less than 2 qullas, then mere contact with najasa renders all of that water contaminated. So it's no longer pure. But if the water is more than 2 qullas, then the rule is we look to see if the characteristics of the water changed, talking about the taste, the color, and the smell. Okay, so if the taste, color, or smell of the water changed, even if it was a tiny change, okay, it changed enough that you could perceive a change. You could tell with the naked eye that this water, the color of it is different now that it touched that najasa, or the smell of it is different now that it touched that najasa, or the taste of it is different now that it touched that najasa. Okay, if the taste, color, or smell of the water changed because of the contact with the najasa, then that water is contaminated by najis filth. What is the case where water might touch najasa, where najasa might come into contact with the water and the water will not become contaminated? That's the case where the water was more than 2 qullas. It was 2 qullas or more. Okay, the water is, let me rephrase this to make it more accurate. 2 qullas or more in volume. And after it came into contact with the najasa, the taste, color, or smell of the water did not change. Okay, the taste did not change in a perceptible way, the color did not change in a perceptible way, and the smell did not change in a perceptible way. In that case, this water remains pure and purifying. Okay, this is the rule for how you can tell if water is, going back to this, whether it's pure or whether it's been contaminated. Okay, how do we know if something is 2 qullas? Okay, there are 2 ways to know if something is 2 qullas in volume. One way is the cylinder method, where you have to sort of imagine a cylinder which has a diameter of 1 cubit and a height of 2.5 cubits. I remind you that a cubit is the distance from the tip of the middle finger to the elbow of an average-sized adult male. Okay, an average-sized adult man, the distance from the tip of his middle finger to his elbow is 1 cubit. So if you can imagine a cylinder that has a diameter of 1 cubit and a height of 2.5 cubits, well, that cylinder holds 2 qullas of water. Your other option is to use the cube method, where if you can imagine a cube, which is 1.25 cubits in length, width, and depth, that also holds 2 qullas of volume. So that's the amount of water that we're talking about here. Insha'Allah ta'ala. It's estimated at about 51 gallons, roughly. 2 qullas is about 51 gallons. So it's a large amount of water, mashallah. Someone asked, is this the same as mud? I don't understand the question. We're talking about water right now. So going back to our initial framework, water will either be pure or impure. And the way you can tell whether it's pure or impure is by first seeing how much water there is, because if it was a small amount of water and it touched najasa, it's automatically contaminated. If it was a large amount of water and it touched najasa, it'll be contaminated if the color, taste, or smell changed, even a little bit, but it will remain pure and purifying if there was no change to the taste, color, or smell. That's how you can tell once the water touches najasa, whether it's still pure or whether it's become impure. Next, we're going to talk about this distinction. If the water is pure, then we need to know whether it's purifying or not purifying. So let's see what it says here in the text. It says, pure water will cease to be purifying if it has been used for purification previously. So one way that pure water will become not purifying is if it's already been used for purification. So the water that you used in your wudu, that water is still pure, but it's not purifying anymore for you to use it again. The water that you use for your ghusl, that water is still pure, but it's not purifying anymore because it's already been used to lift Hadeeth. Okay, any water that was used to lift Hadeeth or to remove najas, that water is used and it cannot be pure and purifying. It cannot be pure and purifying anymore. Let's continue. It says, or if it, talking about pure water, if it has been mixed with another pure substance, not talking about mixing it with something that's najas, if the water was mixed with another pure substance, like milk or ink, and that water changed a lot to the extent that it would no longer be called water. Okay, then this is the other case where the water will be not purifying. where the water mixed with something, not talking about mixing with something najas, it mixed with something else that's pure, something that's not water, but it's pure, like milk. Okay. And because it mixed with this thing that's pure, the water changed, the color changed, the taste changed, the smell changed. And I'm not talking about a small change. I'm talking about a change that was so big that the word water can no longer be applied to this resulting mixture. Okay, the mixture that resulted at the end, you can't even call it water anymore because now it looks like skim milk. Okay, because now it looks like skim milk, for example. All right, so these are the two cases where water will become pure but not purifying. I've also drawn these cases up right here. So let's talk through all these cases, insha'Allah ta'ala. It says, when is water pure but not purifying? Well, one case is if the water was used to perform purification, like wudu, ghusl, istinja, or removing najasa. Okay. If it lifted hadeeth or removed najas, then this water is pure but not purifying. If this water did not lift hadeeth or remove najas, then the water is still pure and purifying. Okay, what do I mean by that? A mud. Okay, I understand now. Mud should have two D's, brother. But it says here, I want you to understand why I put it this way. It says the water was used to perform purification, like wudu, ghusl, istinja, or removing najasa. So what does it mean here when I say it did not lift hadeeth or remove najas? What does that mean? Well, to understand this, you have to understand that just because something is used in purification, it doesn't necessarily mean that it lifted hadeeth or removed najas. For example, and we'll get to this in the next section, inshallah, but when a person makes wudu, he normally does everything 3 times. He'll wash his face 3 times. Okay? The first wash of the face removes the hadeeth from his face. So that water from the first wash, it lifted hadeeth, and so therefore that water is pure but not purifying anymore. But the second wash of his face and the third wash of his face, that water was used to perform purification, but that water did not lift hadeeth or remove najas because the hadeeth was already lifted by the first wash. So the water he used for the second and third washing, that water is still pure and purifying. The only water that is used water was the water from the first wash. And the water from the first wash then is pure, but no longer purifying. So that is this section of the diagram. Okay, water that was used to perform purification in the past. This water is called used water. This blue box is used water, is pure but not purifying. This green box is still pure and purifying. You can use it for purification in the future. What's the other case where water might remain pure but no longer be purifying? It's this example where something pure comes into contact with the water. When we say something pure comes into contact with the water, the next question you need to ask yourself is, what was the nature of the contact? Because there's a difference between something that mixes with the water and something that merely touches the water without mixing with it. Okay, what's an example of something that mixes with the water? It would be like milk or ink or sugar, things like that. When it enters into the water, it mixes with the water, and it ends up in the end being a mixture where you can't tell where is the water and where is the thing that went into the water. You can't tell them apart anymore. This is called mixing. Okay. In Arabic, we say mukhalit. But it's also possible that something might go into the water that does not mix with it. Okay, it's touching the water because it's in the water, but it doesn't actually mix with it. An example would be like a stick. Okay, if someone threw a stick into the water, that stick would be in contact with the water, but it would not actually be mixing with the water. With your eyes, you can still tell where is the water and where is the stick. Okay, you know where the stick ends and the water begins. This is not called mixing. Okay, so if the thing that went into the water is what we call in Arabic mujawir, meaning it's like a neighbor to the water. It's adjacent to the water. It's touching the water, but it's not mixing with the water. If the thing that entered the water is touching the water without mixing with it, then it does not change the status of the water. That water will remain pure and purifying. And it doesn't matter in this case if the taste, color, or smell of the water changed. It doesn't matter. Okay, even if you put something in that water, say like sandalwood is wood. It's not going to mix with the water. But sandalwood has a very strong and very pleasant smell. And if that sandalwood remains in the water, pretty soon the water will acquire the smell of the sandalwood. That would be a case where the smell of the water changed a lot, where it doesn't even smell like water anymore. Okay, this is a large change to the smell, but nonetheless, that water would still have the judgment that it's pure and purifying. Why? Because the thing that made contact with the water, first and foremost, it was pure. And second, it did not mix with the water. So that water is still pure and purifying. But what happens if the thing that touched the water does mix with it? It's something that mixes, like sugar, like Kool-Aid, the powder Kool-Aid. You pour that in the water and it mixes. It becomes one thing now, one liquid. What's the ruling if something mixes, something pure, mixes with the water? Well, if the taste, color, or smell of the water changed a lot, it says in small print here, to the point that it wouldn't be called water anymore, well, then in that case, this mixture is pure, but it's not purifying anymore. I'm going to read it again. If the taste, color, or smell of the water changed a lot to the point that it wouldn't be called water anymore, then this mixture is pure, but not purifying. And an example would be like the Kool-Aid example. Something that's pure was mixed with the water, and it changed the water a lot, to the point where now if somebody saw a cup of that Kool-Aid, they would not say, oh, pass me that cup of water. They would say, pass me that juice, pass me that Kool-Aid. It would not be called water because the taste, color, or smell changed too much. And this is the same ruling if it had been milk that was poured into the water and mixed with it. Okay, if there was so much milk in the water that now if a person entered the room and saw a glass full of this mixture, he would not say, that's a glass of water. He would say, that's a glass of milky water. Or he would say, I don't know, some skim milk, something. Okay, he would not call it water. This is the case where this mixture is pure, but it's not purifying anymore. However, if the thing that you poured into the water was pure, and it mixed with the water, but the taste, color, or smell of the water did not change so much that you couldn't call it water. Okay, it says it did not change a lot. That is, it would still be called water. In this case, the water is still pure and purifying. In this case, the water is what? It's still pure and it's still purifying. An example would be, like say you had a large cup of water, like, I don't know, like 32-ounce cup, a big gulp. And then someone put into your water just like a teaspoon of milk. A teaspoon of milk in the water, yes, the color of the water will change. You'll be able to see that the color has changed, but the color didn't change so much that you wouldn't call it water. If it's just a teaspoon of milk in a 32-ounce cup of water, it's still going to be called water. So in that case, this water is pure and purifying. You could use it to make wudu, inshallah ta'ala. Now there's an exception here to this. I put 2 stars here, and I wrote an exception down at the bottom. It might be hard for you to read, but there is an exception to this rule. There's a case where something pure might mix with the water and change the taste, color, or smell of the water a lot, might change it a lot, to the point where you would not even call it water anymore. But even though it changed so much, it would still be considered pure and purifying. It would not be considered pure but not purifying. What is that case? What is the exception to this rule where something might change the water a lot and the water remains pure and purifying? It says, the exception, if you cannot prevent this thing from mixing with the water, then the water will remain pure and purifying. Okay, there are certain things that are too difficult for us to prevent those things from mixing with the water. Okay, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does not require us to do things that are difficult. Okay, so for example, let's say your source of water were a river. Okay, rivers are going to flow along the ground. They're going to flow in a riverbed. And because they're flowing on top of the ground, they're in contact with the soil that's at the bottom of the river. And the movement of the water will frequently kick up sediment and other things from the ground, which will then mix with the water. And the water's color and taste will change, and the smell will change. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Mississippi River, but I assure you that by the time it gets, down south, like if you've been to Memphis, for example, and you see the Mississippi River in Memphis, that water is brown. It is not clear like clean water. It is very brown from the sheer amount of sediment and soil that is carried along its length. Okay. Ordinarily, if someone mixed so much of something into the water that the color changed that much, ordinarily we would say that that mixture is pure but not purifying. But in this case, we would say that water is still pure and purifying. That water of the Mississippi River, we would say it's still pure and purifying because it's too difficult for us to prevent that river from mixing with the soil that lies at its base. You understand? Like the difficulty of us preventing the water from mixing with that soil means that that particular mixture will not affect the ruling of the water. It will stay pure and purifying. Another example would be like if you have a lake. Lakes very often have trees growing along the edges. And when you have trees growing along the edges, what happens? Leaves fall from the trees into the water. It's possible that so many leaves can fall into the water that it changes the water. That the color or the taste of the water will change because of all the leaves that fell into it. Well, this change also will not affect the ruling of the water. That water is still pure and purifying because it's too difficult for us to prevent those leaves from going into the water. Another example might be, in some desert countries, you have these small streams of water. They're not very big. They don't have a whole lot of water in them. And they might pass over a patch of ground where the ground has like a sulfur deposit. And so the water acquires the smell of the sulfur, which is not a very good smell. And it would change the smell of the water so much that because of the smell, you wouldn't call it water anymore. But even in this case, the water remains pure and purifying because the thing that mixed with the water was a pure substance. And it was too difficult for us to prevent the water from mixing with it. So it will not affect the judgment of the water. I'll give another example. Sometimes if water is very still for a long time, like a bog, you have a small pond, but the water doesn't move. It's not so big that the water moves. There's no waves. When water sits still for a very long time, it can change on its own, even if nothing else mixes with it. No leaves fell into it. There's no, sediment being kicked up by the motion of the water. Nothing mixed with it. But the water on its own changed and began to smell bad. And the color of it changed just because it sat still for so long. In this case also, that water is pure and purifying because this is a change that happened to the water that's too difficult for us to prevent. Okay, so these are what we call exceptions. In these cases, if something pure mixes with the water and changes the taste, color, and smell that much, it will not get the ruling that it's no longer purifying. Instead, it will keep its ruling that it's pure and purifying because our deen doesn't require us to do things that are that difficult. MashaAllah. Okay. Let's go back to the book. I'm going to read the note that's here in the book, and it's just going to repeat what we just talked about. It says, note that if this change, talking about that very large change, okay, the change that's so large that you wouldn't even call this mixture water, it says, if this change occurs due to something very difficult to prevent from mixing with the water, like what's in the path of the water, like sediment in a riverbed, or the place where it pooled, like sediment at the bottom of a puddle, or at the bottom of a lake, or at the bottom of a pond, okay, then it, talk about this large change that occurred, does not affect the ruling of that water. Okay. It says, and the water remains pure and purifying. That means it may be used for purification. What this means is that if the change happened due to something that's easy to prevent the water from mixing with it, then that change will affect the ruling of the water. So, for example, if a person had, just a bucket of iced tea, and he found another bucket of water, and he just poured them together. Okay, that water that got mixed with the iced tea, it would not be called water anymore. It would now be called tea, or watered down tea, or something like that. In that case, this mixture is still pure, but it's not purifying anymore. All right, it's easy to keep iced tea from mixing with water. So that change affects the ruling of the water. The exceptions are only for things that are difficult to prevent from mixing with the water. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Next week, inshallah, we'll move to section 3b, where we'll be talking about lifting minor Hadeeth. So we'll talk about minor Hadeeth, and we'll talk about wudu. If anyone has questions, you can ask now, inshallah. Yes, I see an algae question. Algae is something that also would not impact the ruling of the water, because we can't prevent that from happening. Can these diagrams be downloaded? I haven't posted them anywhere, so I don't know where you would download them from. But if any of you took a screenshot, then yes, you're welcome to keep the screenshot, inshallah. What if you didn't use all the water while removing najas? We're talking about the water that was used. We're not talking about the container. For example, if you had a whole bucket of water and you only used a cup full in order to remove some najas, well, then everything left in the bucket is still pure and purifying. Okay, but the water that you use to remove the najas, that water will become used water with conditions. Actually, in most cases, when you're washing najas, that water will become contaminated by the najasa. But in certain cases, if the conditions are met, then that water will be used water, which means it's pure but not purifying. Mud, yes, a mud. Arabic word mud, M-U-D-D. There's a shadda on the dal. It's a classical weight measure. You have mud and you have saw. Yes, these are all well-known Arabic terms. I thought he was asking about like the English word mud. No, when I said 2 qullas, I described the size of the things we're talking about. A mud is what you can hold in your 2 hands. This is 1 mud. Okay. 2 qullas is a cylinder that's this wide across and 2.5 of those tall. Okay, it's larger than your typical bathtub. Okay, it's larger than your typical bathtub. So when we're talking about 2 qullas, we're talking about something that's much bigger than a mud, much bigger than a saw. Now, what does someone do when wearing a cast? Okay, that has a long and complicated answer, which I'm not going to be able to answer easily here. But it varies depending on what part of your body the cast is on. It varies with whether the cast can be removed safely or not. It varies with whether you were in a state of purification when the cast was first put on. There are a number of variables that affect the ruling here. And I can't cover all the cases right now in a simple answer to a question. And in fact, I didn't even intend on doing it at all in this entire book. It says, if you have an injury that's covered in a bandage and the doctor says, don't let it get wet, does this mean your prayers are not valid? No, that's not what it means. If you have an injury and you need to prevent the water from reaching that particular place, then you prevent the water from reaching that place. Okay, and the short answer is, if this injury, well, first let's just talk about if there's no bandage. You have an injury and it can't get wet, but there's no bandage. And let's say this injury is on one of the body parts that you need to wash in wudu, like say it's on your forearm. In this case, you wash everything of your forearm except that place that you're not allowed to wash. Okay? And if you can wipe on it without washing it, meaning you don't let the water flow on it, but if you can just wipe with a moist hand, then you do that. If you can't even wipe on it, then you don't even wipe on it. So you make as much of the wudu as you can. And then, because you are not able to wash everywhere that needs to be washed, you'll then make a tayammum. You'll make a tayammum. And actually, you'll make the tayammum before you wipe your head or wash your feet. So you'll wash your face, you'll wash as much of your arms as you can, then you'll make the tayammum. And then you'll wipe your head and you'll wash your feet. The tayammum is necessary in this case because you weren't able to make wudu. You missed a spot in your wudu and you had to miss that spot. Now, if the bandage were also on there, then we need to ask whether the bandage is larger than it needs to be or not. If the bandage is not any larger than it needs to be, then in this case, it's similar to what I just mentioned. You wash everything around the bandage, and you'll wipe on top of the bandage, and then you'll make tayammum to make up for the fact that you weren't able to make a full wudu. That's basically the rule. But there's more to it than this. There's more details that I'm not going to scare you with right now, inshallah. Arm casts, we just talked about that one. There are more details, though. There are cases where a person will have to repeat these salats after the cast comes off. So again, I'm not going to go into all of those. If there's a container, the question is, what about the hadith where our loved one, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his wife Aisha, radiallahu anha, shared water for ghusl? Okay, what this means is that they had one container that had water in it. Our Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, removed water from that container and used it for his ghusl. And Aisha removed water from the same container and used it for her ghusl. They're not using used water. Okay, it doesn't mean that the Prophet ﷺ made ghusl and then Aisha was somehow standing under him so that the water that dripped off of him is what she used for her ghusl. No, that's not what it means. Okay, the water in the container is pure and purifying water. And so 10 people can pull from that water if you want. Okay, that's pure and purifying water. It doesn't become used water until it separates from your body. If you take that water from that bucket and then you put it on your body and you use it to lift Hadeeth or to remove najis, then once that water drips away from your body, it's now used water, which means it's pure, but it's not purifying. But the water that's still in the bucket is not used water because it hasn't been used yet. Is there a dua that can be said to make water purifying if you don't know the state of the water? We don't make dua for this purpose. If you don't know the ruling of the water, there's a couple of things. The first question is, why is it that you don't know? Okay, water in general is assumed to be pure and purifying. Okay, if you think back to the diagrams up there, we said water is either pure or it's contaminated. And then I gave you like signs for how do you know if it's contaminated? Like, did najasa touch it? Okay, how would you know if najasa touched it? You would only know if you saw the najasa touch it, or if a trustworthy person told you that najasa touched it. In the absence of those two cases, you would not just assume that najasa touched it. You need evidence. Okay, we've mentioned that if the water is large in volume, 2 qullas or more, that there needs to be a change. So in that case, you would need to have seen the najasa touch the water and have observed a change as well. Or you need to have been told by a trustworthy Muslim that najasa touched the water and that the water changed. So you basically know the status of the water by you observing it or being told by someone who observed it. Otherwise, you assume it to be pure and purifying. The question is, what if a person has a weak bladder or prostate problems? I'm not certain what this has to do with the subject of water. So what you're describing, it sounds like you're talking about incontinence. And inshallah, we'll talk about incontinence when we get further into the prayer section. Inshallah ta'ala. How would you remove the najis water if it reaches your finger or the like? Would you use soil? No, you would use pure and purifying water. So, for example, let's say there was a cup of water and then a drop of wine fell into that cup of water. And then your finger went into the cup. And so now you have contaminated, najis, filthy water on your finger. You would just go to the sink in the bathroom, open up the faucet where pure and purifying water will come out, and you rinse off your finger. And now the najasa has been removed from your finger. But no, you don't use soil for najasa unless it is what we call extreme najasa, which is the najasa of a dog or a pig. And we'll get to that inshallah as well. No more questions? Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Okay, next week, inshallah, like I said, we'll continue. We'll talk next week about minor Hadeeth. We'll talk about the causes, the things that cause minor Hadeeth to come onto your body. And then we'll talk about how to lift minor Hadeeth from your body, which is by making wudu. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. As always, I'd like to close the lesson by saying La ilaha illallah. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the best thing that he and the prophets before him ever said was La ilaha illallah. Yeah, this is a very good thing to say, and I encourage you to say it often. Some of the pious people of the past used to say it many thousand times per day. I mean, many thousand, like 70,000 times in one day. So to say it 3 times at the end of class it's easy, and there's a lot of reward for it, inshallah ta'ala. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Barakallahu feekum. I'll see you next week at the same time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.